Hey, and welcome to episode 10 of Think Like a Hacker. We finally hit double digits, Kathy. Yeah!
Woo!
So, in celebration of episode 10, we're going to change the format slightly. We're going to do 2 episodes a week. The first one in the earlier part of the week is going to be the news, and the one later in the week, usually around Thursday or Friday, depending on when it suits us, will be the interview. And that way, the podcasts are no longer 2 hours long, because we were kind of running up on 2 hours, and they're more like probably a max of an hour, but we're actually targeting much shorter than that. So we're going to try to make it compact, but still nice and fun. And yeah, we've got a bunch of news stories today, and Kathy and I are going to cover them. So get ready for an amazing episode 10 of Think Like a Hacker. Hi, and welcome to episode 10 of Think Like a Hacker. We have some late-breaking news. There's 2 stories that happened a little too close to our recording time yesterday to include in the news, and I really wanted to include them, so I'm including this addendum or this extra in the podcast right at the beginning. So the first story is the release of WordPress 5.2, which goes out today. There's something that's included in that release which is really, really exciting, and it's kind of a game changer for WordPress security. What that is the WordPress core team are including cryptographic signing of core releases in WordPress 5.2. What that means is that the core team will have a private key. When they put out a release, they'll cryptographically sign the release with their private key. The release goes out to your website, and you receive the release, and you also receive a cryptographic signature. Embedded in WordPress 5.2 is a public key belonging to the core dev team. That public key, along with the signature included with the release, can be used to verify that the release of core that you're getting is actually the release that came from the core team. And you can verify that using a combination of the public key that you have and the signature that they've released with the latest core release. That's a real game changer, because a few years ago, I think it was about 2 to 3 years ago now, Matthew Barry from the Wordfence team made a groundbreaking discovery. He discovered that there was a serious vulnerability in api.wordpress.org. This vulnerability allowed an attacker to actually hack into that server, and that's where the core releases come from. And so that's really scary, because if an attacker used that vulnerability, they would break into that server, potentially put out a release of WordPress core with malware in it, and in fact, at the time, it was 27% of the web. Matt, of course, confidentially disclosed this vulnerability to the WordPress core team. They fixed it and released a fix to their own servers. It didn't require a release of WordPress core. And then we ultimately published the research once the vulnerability had been fixed. And you can read that research on our blog. We'll include that in the show notes. But what Matt did is he demonstrated that there was this kind of systemic risk to WordPress. And the way to mitigate that risk is to do what has been included in WordPress 5.2 today. So implement signing with keys that are held offline by the core team. So the core team puts out signed releases. And if an attacker engages in an attack, as Matt described, even though they have access to the WordPress servers, they won't have access to the private keys that the core team is keeping offline. So they can try to put out a release, but ultimately what will happen is your WordPress core will not allow that release to be installed, because the cryptographic signature will fail. Now, the way that this has been implemented is it's a soft fail at this point. So 5.2 is going out, it's doing cryptographic verification of core updates, but if the verification fails, it's not going to not install the release. It's going to either send the admin an email, or if it's an attended update, it will actually show a message to the admin saying, hey, I installed this, but there's something weird going on here. Ultimately, that will become a hard fail, which is exactly what you would want, right? So if you're getting an automatic update from the WordPress servers and that cryptographic signature fails, well, you know that maybe someone hacked the servers, and your WordPress will not install that release, and you'll get a message about that. So that's a huge step forward for WordPress security. Now, a big contributor to this improvement in WordPress security is Scott Arsaszewski. Scott, I guess, I think he was working on this a little bit before we put out our research a few years ago, or before Matt put out his research. But that research kind of motivated the community, and Scott got very involved and kind of pointed to that and said, hey, we really need to implement cryptographic signing. But he didn't just talk, he actually got off his butt and wrote some code. So what Scott did is he wrote a polyfill for the libsodium library. And what that polyfill does is it makes the cryptographic functions in libsodium, which is a very good and strong and modern cryptographic library. It makes those functions available to a PHP developer who wants to use them. So how Scott's polyfill works is if you're using PHP 7.2, it will actually use the underlying cryptographic functions in PHP 7.2, which includes libsodium. If you have a package installed, the PECL package installed for libsodium, it'll use that. But if you don't have anything installed, then he implemented enough of the functions so that you can actually implement things like cryptographic signing in your code. The WordPress core team have used Scott's polyfill in WordPress core, and that's kind of the underlying technology that has enabled them to make cryptographic signing available for WordPress and for WordPress core. So that went out in WordPress 5.2 along with the actual cryptographic signing, and so that was a huge contribution from Scott to the WordPress community and to WordPress. And so we just wanted to congratulate him on that. And I actually called him this morning and we had a chat, and I congratulated him over the phone on 5.2 going out, because it was a long journey, and he really advocated hard to make this happen, and it's finally happened. In chatting with Scott on the phone, the next thing that he's interested in and is pushing for is cryptographic signing for plugins, and it'll provide the same functionality for plugins. So what that means is that a plugin developer who chooses to use this will have private keys. They'll sign their plugin release with their private keys, and you will have a public key for that plugin on your server. When that release hits your WordPress site on your server, WordPress will cryptographically verify that that plugin release comes from that developer, and that the WordPress servers haven't been compromised, or someone else hasn't kind of broken the supply chain and is releasing malicious code to you. So Scott is interested in, well, he's not interested, he's pushing for that now. He's also writing some code to help make that happen, which is awesome. And the way Scott wants it to be implemented is using a public ledger. So that ledger will actually have a public record of the changes to code, who made the changes, what the changes were in the form of file hashes, and so on. So it's a really smart way of doing it, because it creates a kind of audit trail, a security audit trail for changes that happen to plugins. And that audit trail is held in a public ledger. So it's not held by a single organization that can potentially manipulate it to serve their evil means, but it's out there for the general public to consume, and is kind of protected because it's held in a distributed way. So that's what Scott is currently thinking about, and continuing to make great contributions to the WordPress community. So that was the first news item, and we just wanted to congratulate the WordPress core team for putting this out, and thank everyone who is involved, and Scott in particular. And yeah, WordPress 5.2 has either already gone out or it will be going out today. So definitely update that, because it does a great job of improving your security. There's another late breaking news story that I wanted to cover, and this one is kind of an interesting one, a little bit dark. So the Israeli Defense Force, or the IDF, are engaging in a missile exchange with Hamas. They're shooting missiles at each other, and the Hamas cyber operations team decided they wanted to hack some Israeli targets. This is according to Israel. They engaged in a hack. The Israeli Defense Force, or IDF, mitigated that hack, and then what they did is they actually launched an airstrike on the building that the cyber ops team was in. They took out the entire building, and so they basically killed them with missiles. This is the first incident, at least that the general public is aware of, where a cyber operations team has been taken out or killed by a kinetic strike in direct response to a hack. So it's getting a lot of discussion on Twitter and in the information security circles. There was another hacker who was a member of ISIS, and he was targeted by the United States military. This is Junaid Hussain. He was allegedly a hacker for ISIS, targeting US assets. And the United States killed Hussein with a drone strike a few years ago. And that in that case, it's a little bit more blurry because he was not. This was not in a direct response to a hack. He had previously engaged in some hacking, and Hussein was also involved in a lot of other things for ISIS. Apparently, is involved in recruiting and that kind of thing. So this case is a little bit different because the IDF. This was a direct response by the IDF, and it was also an immediate response. These guys were hacking Israeli targets, and in response to that, they mitigated the cyber threat, and they also launched a kinetic attack and took out the entire team. So it's a little bit historic. As I mentioned, it's a little bit dark, a little bit of a dark story, but I'm mentioning this to you because it's getting a lot of discussion in cybersecurity circles. And we'll include a link to the story in the show notes, and you can read more about it. That's it for this update. So back to our regularly scheduled programming. All right, welcome to episode 10 of Think Like a Hacker. Kathy, how are you doing today?
Doing great. How was WordCamp Atlanta?
It was awesome. Atlanta is one of my favorite towns. I met 4 amazing people and did interviews with them. And I think you're really, really going to enjoy them. They're going to be coming up over the next few weeks. Some very, very surprising people. And I'm not going to spoil the story now, but we've got some really cool interviews. We've also changed the format on the interviews, by the way. I'm just sharing this with our listeners. We are shooting the interviews now using opposing cameras, and so it's going to be more of a conversation. And so the interview you'll see this week is, I think, going to be much easier to listen to. The audio is great. You're seeing me and the person I'm talking to, and it's much more of a fun conversation. WordCamp Atlanta was amazing. I think it felt like about 600 people. Do you remember what the attendee numbers were?
It was around 600 people was their expected attendance.
Yeah, it felt like about that. And our booth was extremely busy. Not to blow our own horn, but our booth tends to be one of the busier ones at WordCamp. We are giving lockpicking lessons, and if you successfully pick a lock, we give you a lockpick set, which is a really nice one. We've kind of upgraded them over the last year as we started doing this, and it's now a little pocket lockpick set with our name etched on it, which is super cool. And it was busy, met lots of fun people, and answered a lot of customer questions. Got some feedback, some product feedback from folks. If you're at these WordCamps and we're there, definitely come to the booth. And if you want something in our product, let us know, and usually we'll go ahead and implement it. It was very successful. So thanks to the sponsors and the organizers and the volunteers, and of course the attendees for making it all happen. We had a really good time.
That's so awesome. All the pictures that I was seeing on Twitter and the videos that you guys were doing, it just looked really exciting. I was so sad I wasn't there.
Yeah, well, we definitely missed you, but I did see you at WordCamp. I see the weekend before,
Yeah.
so that was pretty cool.
Yeah. Ready for some news?
I definitely am. Yeah, so our first story today is a data breach of an unknown entity exposing the private data of 80 million US households. What's going on there?
Yeah, this was really interesting. The story was published on April 30th in digitaltrends.com. The primary source was vpnmentor.com. Known hacktivists Noam Rotem and Rand Lokar discovered an unprotected database that had 80 million US households in it. That's about 65% of US households. It was a 24 gigabyte database, and it included the number of people living in each household, the full names, their marital status, income bracket, their age. And if you think about it, because there's more than one person living in a household, it actually directly impacted probably hundreds of millions of individuals. There was no idea who this database belonged to. They couldn't find anyone listed under the age of 40. So the hacktivists were actually asking for some clues, some questions. What service would collect your homeowner status and your dwelling type, but wouldn't collect your social security number? And what service would record that you're married, but doesn't care how many kids you have? So they were giving also a value for people's income, but they couldn't tell if it was a code for an internal ranking system, a tax bracket, or the actual amount. And Later that day, after this article was published, the database was no longer open to the public. So they couldn't tell who this database belonged to. It was on a cloud server that was owned by Microsoft, and Microsoft eventually took that cloud server down and contacted the owner of that database, but they have not revealed who owned it. So it wasn't even clear if this data had been collected because people were, inputting information into a form, or if they had collected it from some other source. But it was rather concerning that all of this, personally identifiable information was just freely available on a cloud server.
Yeah. Yeah, this really frustrates me hearing this, and it really feels like a perfect example of a situation where the Justice Department should step in, subpoena Microsoft and say, hey, we want to know who the customer is. We need to ask them some questions about, well, first of all, make sure that they're accountable for this data breach, and make sure it's not going to happen in the future, and so on. And I guess we haven't heard anything about that, Kathy?
No, this just happened last week, where the disclosure was made that this database existed and that Microsoft took it down. It kind of all happened within one day, on April 30th last week. So we don't have any information about who might have accessed this information, where else it might have been tied to, and who owned it and who was ultimately responsible for protecting this personally identifiable information, or why it was even on a cloud server.
Yeah, interesting. Well, perhaps we'll hear some follow-up about this in the coming weeks, as they take action. Who knows? But certainly a weird one. Moving on to the next story. There was a Gutenberg accessibility audit, and it found significant and pervasive accessibility problems with Gutenberg. Now, just to give you some context here, Gutenberg is, of course, the new block-based editor that was released with WordPress version 5.2, and one part about Gutenberg that was controversial, and I'm sure a lot of you know this because you're of course involved in the WordPress space, but one part that was controversial was the accessibility of Gutenberg. It was actually less accessible than the previous editor, so it was a step back, even though it's supposed to be the new and awesome editor for WordPress, and supposed to become the standard for what everyone uses. Back in late 2018, last year, the lead of the accessibility team resigned over the controversy around that. And Gutenberg was launched, some might say successfully, but it certainly is in production now. And it seems like the controversy was blowing over, but there was a accessibility audit done by Tenon LLC, and it was funded by the community. I think it was a crowdfunding campaign, wasn't it, Kathy?
Yes, Rachel Cherry, who runs WP Campus, which is sort of WordPress for higher ed, she is very firmly committed to accessibility, and so she sort of led the charge. And I actually donated to this audit just to further along the cause of WordPress, because I felt that it was important, and it's I. I didn't get through the whole executive summary. It was a little hefty. But
So the entire audit is 329 pages long, and I got chatting with someone at WordCamp Atlanta about this, and that was the first time I heard the length of the audit, and I thought that was crazy, but not crazy, but lengthy. What's really surprising is the executive summary is 34 pages, which is, to be quite honest, it seems a little bit absurd. And I'm sure there's a justification for this thing being that long, but I'll just be completely honest. I mean, that would be really hard for me to find the time to read that. And the trouble is that I think to be kind of entitled to have an opinion on this, one has to be informed and have read the entire thing. And so this really puts a bit of a barrier up to folks getting up to speed on what Tenon LLC thinks the status of Gutenberg is in terms of accessibility, and being able to express an opinion on that. Wouldn't you say, Kathy?
yeah, it's hard to get through. I mean, I was watching Rachel Cherry, who led this whole charge, was sort of live tweeting her review of reading through the entire thing. I think on Saturday she got through 200 pages of the entire thing, which, wow. That's
Yeah.
a feat in and of itself. But I mean, this is really an important issue. And so I think, having this large document is important, but we're going to have to rely on other people within the community to really distill the most important issues within accessibility for Gutenberg that must be taken care of as soon as possible in order to move things along. This is really important for US government websites as well as any organization that receives government funding, which is a lot of universities, which is why I think WP Campus funded or led the charge towards this. And I do believe that Automatic did fund part of this as well. So they are, behind pushing things forwards in terms of accessibility because of the wide impact that Section 508, the accessibility standards, has for so many organizations.
Yeah, and I think I read this in WP Tavern, which has some excellent coverage on this, so kudos to them, that I believe it was Automatic, and I think they said Matt Mullenweg personally assisted with some funding. Not sure if I misunderstood, but understood that, but that's kind of cool.
That is.
So the audit found that Gutenberg fails to comply with all 30 of the WCAG 2.1 success criteria. And just for context here, the WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's developed through the W3C in cooperation with individuals and organizations around the world with a goal of providing a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. From Tenon LLC's executive summary, they say that Gutenberg has significant and pervasive accessibility problems. This is a direct quote, the likes of which amount to a step backwards for users with disabilities over the legacy editor. Ouch. Our user-based testing, backed by data from our technical review, indicates that the accessibility problems are severe in nature. We feel concerned that Gutenberg's current accessibility issues will prove problematic for website owners who deploy Gutenberg to content creators in protected populations, or for website owners who are themselves part of a protected population. Therefore, organizations which have high-risk profiles should consult legal counsel before using it, meaning Gutenberg, and may want to choose to use the legacy editor instead. Now, I thought the phrase protected population there was very interesting because it implies protection against discrimination with a legal recourse available. So they're saying don't deploy Gutenberg if you are legally required to serve all users. And this is my interpretation of this, right? So they're suggesting don't deploy Gutenberg if you're legally required to serve all users, including those with accessibility needs, because you risk being sued, basically. That's my understanding of what they mean by that phrase in that executive summary. And I think that kind of transmits or communicates the gravity of this problem quite well. One of the thoughts I had on this, and I actually really want to get your take on this, Kathy, at the risk of, I don't know if this is going to be controversial or not, but I wonder if an accessible editor for WordPress is the answer, since WordPress has the ability to create and use different editors. Kind of like an accessible keyboard is used instead of a traditional keyboard, rather than trying to make a traditional keyboard accessible to everyone. Perhaps having an editor that is specifically the accessibility editor and provides the functionality of Gutenberg, kind of the same flexibility. But I had this thought that if they take that approach, and I don't know if that approach is problematic in various ways, but if they take that approach, I had this thought that from a developer point of view, it may actually free them up to do even more in terms of accessibility than they can do with Gutenberg. Any thoughts on that?
That's actually quite brilliant. And there's probably a huge market for that, especially in the higher ed world. It would be really cool if a user, rather than being dictated by the WordPress installation that they're using, if a user could select which kind of editor specifically they wanted to use, or the editor that was right for them, rather than just having to deal with whatever the super admin for whatever installation says that they have to use.
Yeah, yeah, sort of a drop down or whatever that lets you select the editor. But just to take the other side of the table for the moment and argue with myself, I guess a counterpoint to that would be, well, Gutenberg is new, it's awesome, it has amazing capabilities. We want it too, folks that need it to be accessible. And so this idea that they would get a different editor might make folks like that feel really shortchanged. So I don't know. I guess I wanted to think out loud about that for a moment.
Sure. Well, I mean, I've used WordPress for a very long time, and I help people who use page builders, like Divi, to build pages, and that's kind of like a different editor, right? And so that like when you're developing with a site that's using Divi, there's pages that you can develop using the old editor. You can use Gutenberg, or you can say, I want to use the Divi editor, and they now have this thing where you can actually see the like live site on the front end and edit everything right there, which just too much for me. But for some people that I advise, they're like, hey, wow, I can see what I'm editing while I'm editing it. That's great. And so I think, maybe we're at the advent of flexibility with editing where people can have different editors based upon their technical need, all within one site.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So I guess we'll see how that evolves. But really heavy report from Tenon in both terms of volume and the message that they're sending, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So DuckDuckGo is doing some really interesting things, and I kind of like these guys. What's going on there, Kathy?
Well, from The Verge on May 1st of last week, DuckDuckGo wrote a bill to stop advertisers from tracking you online. I would imagine you'd like this one. You probably don't like being tracked online as much, do you, Mark?
Well, I don't like it, but I haven't mitigated against it that much. I don't run an ad blocker, believe it or not. And
Really?
honestly, after reading this article today, as we were researching the various stories we're covering for the podcast, I thought to myself, why the heck am I not running an ad blocker at least? So
Yeah.
yeah, I could definitely do more. But yeah, let's put it this way. I do like this story in particular and what Gabriel Weinberg is doing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So this DuckDuckGo CEO Gabriel Weinberg is mounting this campaign to revive the Do Not Track standard. Now, there was a Do Not Track standard many years ago, but everything kind of fell apart in 2012. Thank you, Internet Explorer. They started setting Do
Right.
Not. Can I just blame everything that's wrong on the internet to Internet Explorer back in the old days?
Yeah,
But
I don't see
anyway.
anything wrong with that. I mean,
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Just speaking truth. So Internet Explorer came out and decided, hey, we've got all this. We're just going to start setting do not track to true for everything. And because that kind of like broke the do not track standard was kind of this voluntary thing. So sites that saw do not track would not track if they saw that setting. But when Internet Explorer decided in 2012 to set that do not track basically on for everyone, sites started just ignoring the setting because you couldn't tell if a user had actually chosen to not be tracked or if it was just the default setting because somebody updated Internet Explorer. So this has been around for a while, but DuckDuckGo CEO Gabriel Weinberg is bringing it back. So this is kind of a long shot because so many people are tracking, and he doesn't have any lawmakers signed on yet, and bills like this have been stalled out in Congress many times before. So you can still set most modern browsers to do not track, but they aren't being, because of this Internet Explorer issue, are not being followed. Now, he has an obvious interest in disrupting the online tracking ecosystem because DuckDuckGo is a privacy-first browser, or not browser, but search engine. I also have a privacy-first browser that I was just looking at and thinking, hey, wow, it's kind of like the same thing as what the Brave browser is trying to do. That there are a lot of organizations out there that are trying to push the envelope for privacy. So these bills have come up many times before. It would be really interesting to see something like this kind of gain some traction in Congress and get some lawmakers behind it, but I don't have a lot of hope for it. What about you, Mark?
I don't either, but I don't know that it matters. I think that there's a couple things here. First of all, Gabriel and DuckDuckGo have taken a step in the right direction and started a conversation, and I think that's great. And the other thing is, you mentioned there's a few organizations, whether it's browser vendors or search engine vendors, who are doing things like this, and I think that's really cool. And what they're doing is using privacy as a differentiator. And I think that as consumers become more educated about privacy and their rights, and there are more and more data breaches, and those have bigger and bigger consequences, and those have material impact, and we get to hear about stories from relatives on how a data breach impacted them and so on, consumers will begin to gravitate towards companies that are doing things to improve privacy and who have incorporated better privacy controls into their products, or have released products that enhance privacy. And so I think privacy as a differentiator, which is what DuckDuckGo is doing, is really interesting. And I'm going to certainly keep an eye on that. And I'm certainly more interested in DuckDuckGo now that Gabriel and the team over there has done this. So I'm just going to go ahead and encourage you to give DuckDuckGo a try, see what you think. And if you prefer to Google, definitely use it. They seem to be taking your privacy seriously, and that is really cool.
Yeah, as contrasted to the company that's leaving 80 million households' information on a cloud server, huh?
Right. Yeah, exactly. The company that is nameless. So, in other news, a mysterious hacker has been selling Windows ZeroDays to APT groups for the last 3 years. And this looks, it's on ZDNet that's covered this on May 1st. And I'm assuming this is Catalin Kimpanu again, Kathy.
Yes.
Awesome. Good coverage from him usually. So yeah, definitely credit to them. But so an unknown hacker has been selling Windows ZeroDays to at least 3 cyber espionage groups, as well as cybercrime gangs. Kaspersky Labs Global Research and Analysis Team, or GREAT, as they're known, and it's not all uppercase, there's some weird capitalization there, have been doing research into these ZeroDays being sold by companies to APTs. Just as a reminder, an APT in cybersecurity parlance is an advanced persistent threat, and it's usually a nation-state actor. It's someone who has been around for a while, is going to be around for this foreseeable future, is extremely well-funded, usually has a very large team, and that's why that's how they behave, and it's usually nation states that have the resources and capabilities and motivations to run these teams. And so the story is really saying that these ZeroDays have been sold to countries, which are APTs. So the price for Windows ZeroDays seemed to range from about $50,000 to about $200,000. And in the article, which we'll post in the show notes, there's some specific examples given. There's evidence that government-backed cyber espionage groups will regularly buy these ODays from third parties. Right before beginning recording, I actually pinged our team to find out if ZeroDays are being bought or sold in the WordPress space. I wanted an update on that. And one company that claims to be buying ZeroDays is Zerodium, and there's a link to a program that they have on their site that I think mentions WordPress vulnerabilities, WordPress ZeroDays. And so they're certainly engaging in that. I don't know what the price is offhand, but we're beginning to see that in the WordPress space. WordPress, I think, may emerge as a target for APTs. And the reason why is because there are millions of WordPress sites globally. Each site has significant bandwidth, usually about 10 megabits per second or more, sometimes 100 megabits or even more than that. So that gives the attacker, if they own the site, that gives them a lot of resources to go out there and do malicious work with a very high bandwidth connection. The sum of all the user data across all WordPress sites is enormous. I suspect that if you were to aggregate up all of that user data and user PII across all WordPress sites. It's probably quite a lot larger than the largest data breach in history, which, as a reminder, is Yahoo, which was breached in 2013, and that was 3 billion records that were breached. And I think if you look at single WordPress sites, it looks kind of small, but if you kind of sum all of those up and consider that one large data breach, or let's say WordPress sites breached over 1 year of one particularly bad year, my guess is it could be quite a bit larger than the largest breach that we've ever seen. And so I think for those reasons, WordPress either is or will become a target of APTs, and this is the kind of thing that we need to start thinking about, where you have APTs that have significant resources, are highly motivated, and are willing to buy 0 days from a researcher. So yeah, we'll certainly keep an eye on that. Yeah, so in other news, Mozilla has banned Firefox add-ons with obfuscated code. That is interesting, and it sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it?
It certainly does. So we saw this on Beta News on May 2nd, and it stated that there is a June 10th deadline for anyone who has a Firefox add-on. If they have obfuscated code in that add-on, they have to get rid of it. They're not going to allow extensions that have obfuscated code. And the reason why is because obfuscated code often contains malware. They're trying to hide something about that add-on. We see this often in malware, where we'll just see strings of just looks like gibberish. If you understand how to read PHP and you see obfuscated code, it's nothing that's legible. You can't really tell what's going on with that code unless you run it through some kind of deobfuscation and able to see what's actually happening with it. So it makes perfect sense that Mozilla would not allow obfuscated code. I mean, there's some like paid plugins that we often see that have obfuscated code because they're trying to hide like the functionality. The WordPress repository actually bans obfuscated code for much the same reason. So in clarifying the reasons why, obviously they are doing this for security. They are going to err on the side of user security when determining whether or not they are going to block an add-on in the Firefox repository. And they are going to continue blocking extensions for intentionally violating any of their policies, anything that looks like it has a security vulnerability. And anything that is going to compromise user privacy or circumvent user consent or user control of the browser that they're using. So it looks like Mozilla this to me seems like an obvious good step for any organization that's managing any kind of repository of code that's being submitted by, who knows, to make sure that there is no obfuscation. You can tell exactly at first glance what that piece of code is doing.
Yeah, so really, really some of the problems that they're having to deal with compared to the WordPress plugin repository, which is interesting. So yeah, we might be able to learn from each other. But another story that caught our eye was a mysterious hacker group is on a supply chain hacking spree. And just to kind of remind our viewers and listeners of what a supply chain attack is this is when a hacker goes after the folks that are developing the code for a particular product, and they'll actually attack the place where the source code is stored, or the developer's environment, or their dev tools, or something like that. But the goal is ultimately to get something malicious into the supply chain of software. So software is supplied by developers who write the code, they hand that to QA tests the code, then there's a deployment process, and ultimately the code is distributed out to customers. So that is the supply chain in most organizations, and I'm sure there's some additional complexity there, but if you are able to attack any part of that supply chain and get your malicious code into the code that's on its way to customers, that's a supply chain attack, and it is really, really powerful. So Kathy, do you want to dive into the story for us?
Sure. This was it was in Wired on May 3rd last week. 6 different companies have been tied to a single group of probably Chinese-speaking hackers, and how they discovered that it was probably Chinese is kind of funny to me, hiding in plain sight type of thing. So this group, they're calling them barium in this article, but they're also sometimes known as Shadowhammer, Shadowpad, or Wicked Panda. I personally would have chosen Wicked Panda for the story, but it sounds more fun, doesn't it?
Totally, yep.
But they're demonstrating that this group's ability to disrupt computers on a vast scale and exploiting vulnerabilities in the most basic trust model, governing the code that users run. I mean, when you're sitting in front of your computer and it says that you need an update, and you go and you click update because you assume that everything's going to go just fine, and you're getting all kinds of security patches, bug fixes, maybe some new features. But in these cases of what they saw Barium or Wicked Panda do, they saw some fascinating, interesting history of their attacks. It started in July of 2017 with a backdoored version of NetSarang, which was a popular enterprise remote management tool that was distributed by a Korean firm. They breached NetSarang's network and planted malicious code in the product before the application was cryptographically signed. So there was malicious code, but it's cryptographically signed, and it's still ending up on your systems. And so it really breaches that trust between developer and the company you're buying your software from, and your systems. They also saw a couple months later, Crap Cleaner, or C Cleaner, as it's now been named after Avast took over a Piriform. That breached over 700,000 machines. And there was malicious, you updated C Cleaner and it had this malicious code within it. In January of 2019, ASUS was backdoored, and that affected over 600,000 machines. That code actually had a list of target MAC addresses that would allow the malware to not have to communicate with a command and control server, so that researchers couldn't really tell what was going on. So Silas Cutler is a researcher at Alphabet, or Google-owned security startup Chronicle, has been tracking them, and he is comparing this group to, in these cases, to software supply chain attack that was used to launch the NotPetya cyber attack in 2017, and that caused a record-breaking $10 billion in damage globally after a piece of Ukrainian accounting software had a supply chain attack. And because of the sophistication of this barium group, they think they could do a lot worse. They seem to be focused on spying or espionage rather than destruction.
So really more of an APT approach there, huh?
Yeah, definitely. And it looks like, from what they said, with the one supply chain attack was enabling another. So like the CCleaner attack targeted ASUS, which got the access that it needed from the company's updates from that first attack. So it kind of, one attack bred another. And they found that these hackers seem to speak Chinese, and they typically live in mainland China. But one of the funny things I saw in this article was that they had identified a Google Doc that had all kinds of information in it, but it was using actually like a resume template, and it had Chinese characters with a default phone number using country code 86, indicating mainland China. And I thought that was really interesting, that they're like using tools that you and I would use like on a regular basis, like Google Docs, to share information, and they're kind of almost hiding in plain sight, but that the attacks themselves can be somewhat difficult to ascertain what's going on because they're so sophisticated. So we've seen some attacks like this in the WordPress space, haven't we, Mark? And I mean, this is something we have to keep an eye on for how this might affect WordPress.
Yeah, for sure. So we've seen threat actors or bad actors buying up WordPress plugins and injecting malicious code into those plugins, and then distributing that out. And the code would load just spammy stuff some really nasty stuff actually, escort websites and that kind of thing. And I think that I'm really concerned about WordPress and the repo, the plugin repo, as a and its vulnerability to supply chain attacks. Right now, the WordPress does not use code signing for the plugin repository, for example. So what that means is that in other software ecosystems like the App Store and Google Play and so on, the Apple App Store, developers will cryptographically sign their software with their private keys, thereby proving that it's really them who is releasing the software to you, and you have their public key available, and you can use that to verify that the developer you think wrote the software is actually the one that released it. And those keys are kept offline by the developers. So if something is hacked at an infrastructure level, the attacker won't have access to those private keys to sign a release. You're talking about some attacks here, Kathy, where it's a supply chain attack and cryptographic keys were being used to sign things. We don't even do that in WordPress. And so if a developer account is compromised, it's fairly easy for an attacker to release malicious code to the into the WordPress ecosystem and orchestrate that kind of supply chain attack. And there are ongoing conversations about this. There's a sodium compat cryptographic library which now exists in WordPress core, and that makes it more feasible to do things like cryptographic signing of core releases and of plugins and that kind of thing. There's also a lot of folks who want to implement this and are pushing for it. I'm one of them. And there are ongoing conversations, back channel conversations with some very, very senior leadership in the sort of WordPress core community about implementing this. I'm not going to dive into the details of that right now, but it's I think it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. So hopefully we'll see that. But yeah, supply chain attacks on the rise. And speaking of which, this isn't really a supply chain attack. This is more of a supply chain DOS, I guess. But a hacker is wiping out Git repositories and asking for a ransom. So Git is, of course, a place where you can keep your software and check in new changes and track your changes and that kind of thing. Git is a super popular source management tool. And in this case, hundreds of developers have had Git source code repositories wiped and replaced with a ransom demand. This has been coordinated across Git hosting services, GitHub, Bitbucket, GitLab, and so on. It's still unclear how they're happening. This is from this particular article that was our sources from May 3rd, 2019, so a few days ago. And the attacker removes all source code and recent commits from victim Git repositories. They leave a ransom note asking for a payment of 0.1 Bitcoin or $570, which at the time of this writing, that's what that's worth. Or else the code goes public. There's a 10-day deadline, and the Bitcoin wallet at the time of writing was empty. There's been about 27 abuse complaints that we've seen on bitcoinabuse.com. And the victims that are being, folks that are falling victim to this are admitting to weak passwords. So that seems to be the attack vector here. Evidence suggests that the hacker scanned the internet for Git config files, extracted the credentials to the repository, and then used those logins to access and ransom the accounts at Git hosting services. Bad Packet Reports, which is run by Troy Mersch, who's a really cool guy. I've chatted with Troy. He tweeted that, dang, I thought all those /git/config scans we detected were harmless. Guess we now know what the goal was. So yeah, absolutely. And I guess Troy and his team were seeing those scans. And the Stack Exchange Security Forum have found that the hacker does not actually delete the repo, but alters the Git commit headers, meaning that the code commits may be able to be recovered. So yeah, less of a supply chain attack and more of just a denial of service with a straight up ransom in that case, Kathy?
Yeah, it looks that way. It looks like it's still kind of a developing story. It doesn't look like anybody's paid that ransom, and people are hopeful they'll get their code back. And it looks like hopefully that if they can ascertain that this was password issues, just ensure you have your two-factor authentication turned on for all of your Git.
Yeah, interesting story, Kathy. So yeah, I guess the supply chain is either being compromised or being DOSed in various ways. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that. In another story, the Firefox, which is made and distributed by the Mozilla team, had a major issue with their add-ons. They had an intermediate certificate which is built into the Firefox browser. It expired, and I guess someone forgot to renew that. And so all of the add-ons, as of I think was that Friday night midnight UTC. I think that was about the time this went down, wasn't it, Kathy?
Yeah, I woke up to, I think, a tweet from you alerting me to, before I even had gotten online, that this had happened.
Yeah, I was in Atlanta for WordCamp Atlanta, and I was working late, and I caught this. And yeah, it was a really, really interesting one. They resolved it really, really quickly, but the effect was that all add-ons for Firefox were disabled, and the users of Firefox had to install an update because the certificate was hard-coded in the browser in order to re-enable their add-ons. And the reason we're covering the story is because there's a little bit of a security angle here. Some Firefox add-ons are for security reasons, like password managers, things that protect your privacy, ad blockers, that kind of thing. And so those were actually disabled by this. And it didn't last very long. The Firefox team responded super, super quickly, which is awesome. And they released Firefox 66.0.4, and that fixed the issue. And it was released 3 days ago, so almost immediately after this happened. But yeah, interesting story. So just check, if you use Firefox, and I know a lot of you do, check that you are at least on version 66.04, and that has the fix. But onto something in the Japanese ecosystem. So the Japanese government have declared that they're going to create and maintain defensive malware, and this is May 5th, which was yesterday. Interesting one, hey Kathy?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. There are a number of countries that have sort of these offensive malware programs: Israel, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and I'm sure the United States have cyber weaponry. NATO formally declared cyber an official battlefield in June of 2016, along with air, land, and sea as different battlegrounds. So Japan has basically decided that this is something that they need to be able to do. In the article, they cited China and their growing military capabilities as a reason that they need to develop these types of tools. Japan says they're only going to use these things against the attacker versus, say, something like Stuxnet, which is considered by some to be the most sophisticated software ever developed, which spread onto the internet. That worm spread to an engineer's computer that had been connected to centrifuges at Natanz and spread further when the engineer returned home and connected his computer to the internet. And research into Stuxnet pretty much determined that there had to have been a nation state associated with this worm. And so it's just kind of interesting to me that Japan is getting into this. It seems like more and more countries will start developing sort of an offensive malware type of tool set in order to deal with situations that they're seeing with other countries. It just seems like a new battleground. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think that the story of Stuxnet is really instructive. The fact that, I think the prevailing theory there is that Stuxnet was developed by the United States in cooperation with Israel, although no one has ever confirmed that as far as I know. And Stuxnet so the point there being that Stuxnet was developed by some very sophisticated teams. It was highly targeted. It targeted a uranium enrichment centrifuge or uranium enrichment facility that had centrifuges, and the goal there was to damage the centrifuges and do it in a way that was undetectable, and apparently it succeeded. And even in that case, in that highly targeted attack where sophisticated teams that presumably are quite experienced in terms of cyber attacks use Stuxnet to target Natanz, that still got out. It still leaked out onto the internet. And so this idea that Japan can develop offensive malware and in the story or the statement, they say that it will only be used to target the attacker. Well, it doesn't really work that way, guys. This stuff is going to leak out. It's going to do a lot of damage. And, we're not talking about missiles here where you control something that's guided by GPS and has a very finite and well-defined blast radius. The blast radius of malware is global. So good luck with that. And good luck to us all, because it's going to be affecting us all.
It is. And the thing that interested me also with this article is that they're not, they aren't going to have government employees developing this malware. They're hiring contractors to do it, which to me sort of reeks of a little bit of desperation, where they may feel like they're behind the 8 ball, or they're behind in the cyber wars or whatever. So to me, it just seems like there's going to be less controls. There's going to be less thought about, what happens if something does leak out onto the internet. And this has wide-reaching impacts. I mean, it could affect an electrical grid. It can affect, civilian situations. It could have, I don't know how far something like this could go, but so much of our lives is dependent upon computerization. To have these countries knowingly developing malware and not really thinking through fully what they're doing with it is frightening.
Yeah, agreed. And I didn't actually think too much about the fact that they're using contractors, and I'm really glad that you spotted that. I think it's really interesting. I wonder if they're also playing accountability games there. So if a contractor develops malware that does get out, the Japanese government can point the finger at the contractor and not necessarily be held accountable. So anyway, we will see how that evolves. But one more thing to make the cyber universe a little bit more of a scarier place, huh?
Indeed. Keeps us busy.
Sure does. All right, well, that's a news wrap. And as I mentioned, we had a really wonderful time with our friends in Atlanta at WordCamp this weekend. So greets to them. And that is the wrap of the podcast. As I mentioned, we're doing the interview segment a little bit later in the week, probably around Thursday, if all goes well. And we're going to have a really great interview lined up for you. So thanks very much for watching or listening, if you're listening on one of your podcast apps. If you're on YouTube, definitely like and subscribe. That helps us get the podcast out there, and it also alerts you to when we release new episodes. Have a wonderful week, and stay safe out there. Bye, everyone.